Just to say, I've thoroughly enjoyed every single one of these events. The questions have been unfailingly fascinating. What I think is valuable about behavioral science and creativity is that simply 2 additional toolkits. And at no point can you confidently say we can ignore these toolkits, because the solution may be psychological or it may be highly creative or inventive. And my argument is that what's gone wrong with business and institutional and even political decision making is that there's an obsession with the single toolkit. Fundamentally, the need to appear rational is making us stupid. That's if you like that's if you like a sort of single paragraph description of where I think a lot of decision making has gone wrong.
Is there a list of questions you typically go through to shape at least the initial investigation of the challenge or problem or campaign?
That's a really good question. And the first requirement is, okay, there is an inherent problem in any institution. If you're in business, if you're in the public sector, if you're in charity, it doesn't matter. Okay, which is if someone gives you a problem to solve, you want to be seen to be caring about and tackling that problem. And so the natural instinct is to tackle the problem head on. However, if you are happy and if you create, and this is my biggest plea, by the way, for ad agencies, is the real value we can add to our clients is actually in creating an initial space for ambiguity. And there's a book, someone's asking for book recommendations. Margaret Heffernan, brilliant writer, she's actually resident in the UK, has written a book called Embracing Uncertainty. And what we like to do is to appear certain. And we also like to appear that we're tackling the problem with lots of resources dedicated to directly tackling the problem head on. And the story I always tell about that recently is that I met someone who is like the government's walking czar. It was one of those positions where they're effectively involved in campaigning for design of spaces, footpaths, legal changes that make it possible for people to walk more. And I said, so what, effectively what you're doing is campaigning for more public footpaths. Perfectly worthy aspiration, by the way. But I also made the opposite suggestion, which is that there is really a massive shortage of horizontal surfaces in the UK. If you want to walk, assuming it's not icy, there are quite a lot of flat spaces where you can walk. It's not Switzerland, it's not massively mountainous. And I said, and this was an insight, not because I'm particularly insightful, because I'd recently had a bout of sciatica, which is back pain. I said, I think you may need to look at the opposite problem, which is the problem that there's nowhere to sit down. Because obviously fit people, the more they can walk, the more they walk. Some people like walking, they're keen on walking. If you're the people who, this is where often one interesting solution is a really interesting definition of your target audience, okay? Because if you take the target audience as the average person, you go, we want the average person to walk more. The average person walks a bit. We want them to walk a bit more. But one of my definitions of the target audience is people who'd like to walk but can't. And my argument is that if you're elderly, if you go to a seafront, there are tons and tons of benches all along the seafront, many of them memorial benches. And what you will see along the seafront is tons and tons of relatively elderly people or people who don't always walk all that much, walking a hell of a lot. Why are they doing it? Partly because they know they'll always be able to sit down. And I actually, when I had sciatica, I get into Charing Cross Station. I've got to walk to Soho or to West Street or wherever it was. And I suddenly realized with the sciatica that occasionally, after about 700 yards, you just need to either lean against the lamppost or sit down. And you do that for 30 seconds or a minute, and then you can set off and walk again. And then you can walk for a bit further, so on. I suddenly realized that actually a lot of people don't walk because once you're 500 yards from your house, if you suddenly feel you don't want to walk anymore, you can't walk anymore, or you don't want to walk for a bit, or if you need to check your phone, right, there's nowhere to sit. And so I just said, look, actually, the way you solve your problem depends on who your target audience is. And the critical target audience, which is people who should be walking more but aren't, are probably not walking, not because there isn't a path, but because there isn't a seat. And so it's really, really important, I think, also to say, One way of doing this is don't define the target audience as Mr. Average or Mrs. Average. Okay. Instead, look at lots of different ways to define a target audience and say which are the ones which are actually probably amenable to change, and which are the ones which are impossible to change, which are the ones who will benefit the most. Because quite often we assume that what we've got to do is change behavior on average. And actually, in many complex cases, you know, actually a lot of businesses, if you've got a nice market of 7% of people, that's enough to base a business on. You know, you don't have to appeal to everybody.
I'm going to ask Rory a question from the live Q&A function from John O'Miller. What's the most counterintuitive insight you've discovered about human decision making that marketers still consistently ignore?
Ooh. I mean, partly it's contradiction, which is that you can sell something on the basis that everybody likes it, and you can sell something on the basis of not many people have it. So that's one thing, which is that sometimes you need to look at the opposite. Obviously, the one that's probably the most counterintuitive one is how common it is for price increases to actually come accompanied with an increase in demand. Because the way in which the consumer is making a decision is partly using price as an indicator of quality and partly using price to navigate, which is logically people should go, I have a problem and I want to solve it at the lowest possible price. But actually, a lot of people do it backwards, which is I have a budget to spend on this problem. And I want, you know, I'm prepared to spend X pounds to solve this problem. And therefore, I want to spend as close as possible to X for the maximum efficacy of problem solving. So I'll tell you a new story I only heard I was in Texas last week. They were talking about the Yeti brand of those things which are coolers, water bottles. You know them? I'm not talking about a brand no one has heard of them. They're very robust. It all started with a load of fishermen who said, we're sick of these coolers because they're kind of shit. We want to manufacture a cooler that you can actually stand on. That was the brief. That, you know, an overweight man could stand on this ice box or cooler and it would take their weight. And they went out to China and they started manufacturing these things, and they went into robust water bottles and hydration solutions, all, you know, and backpacks and all the stuff. And then their Chinese supplier got into trouble with the Chinese Communist Party or was arrested or something. And they had this huge problem that it was going to take them 6 months to gear up another supplier. And they said, well, the only thing we can do is we've got a warehouse full of stuff. We don't want to run out of stuff, so let's put the price up to slow down the sales in the intervening period so we don't actually run out of stock and people forget who we are. And to their absolute amazement, when they put the price up, the sales went up. Because there were a load of people who wanted a £40 water bottle for whatever reason, who didn't want a £20 water bottle. And there's an element of kind of sadomasochism in shopping, which is if something really matters to someone, they want to spend an amount of money that slightly hurts. Okay, it's the only way I can describe it. Okay, that's one counterintuitive thing. I mean, the other counterintuitive thing is sometimes you want to add friction rather than remove it. That's also counterintuitive. Sometimes you put the price up rather than decreasing it to increase demand. Sometimes other examples would be, I was just thinking of one a second ago, where
whilst you're thinking on that point, I've got a friend who sort of came up with the point that if they dropped the price of caviar, sales would go down because it actually tastes really quite bad and it's a status thing.
There's actually a guy. Its appeal really is like champagne. It's in the signaling of hospitality and generosity. And there's apparently the guy who was the head of the International Caviar Trade Organization freely admitted that if it cost the same price as jam, nobody would buy it. So those things are known by economists. They're called Veblen goods, and their very scarcity and expense is what signals their value. I mean, I would argue that at the top end, property is a Veblen good, that you're more in the business of signaling that you have an expensive house than really enjoying lifestyle benefits through the ownership of that house. You know, I mean, country houses, in a sense, must have been a royal pain in the arse, because they're vastly bigger than anybody else would actually want as a place to live, even with servants. And, you know, a lot of those things, I think, are... The problem is, of course, that has a knock-on effect on property prices for people who just want a place to live. So the status component and the investment component of the property market basically have a poisonous effect on what you might call the utility component of the property market, which is people who simply need a place to live are having to compete with people who want to have a place as a store of value or want to have a place as a, you know, to show off. So that is really, really problematic. Other counterintuitive things, I mentioned price. Small things sometimes have very big effects. So most people tend to think that in order to have a huge emotional effect, you need to spend a lot of money. Actually, as Winston Churchill proved, or as the Doubletree cookie proves, or as the Uber map proves, sometimes it's something actually remarkably cheap, which just changes the emotion. You know, it could be a change in wording, it could be a change in framing, it could be a change in, it could be a change in what's, you know, it could be a change simply redirecting the consumer's attention to something which they hadn't previously paid attention to, so that having then paid attention to that thing. So another counterintuitive thing is, by the way, often attitude follows behavior just as much. Attitude follows behavior just as much as behavior follows attitude. That's also counterintuitive, in the sense that we tend to think that in order to make young people, or, you know, in order to make people who don't travel by train, we've got to make them love the train. Now, in defense of sales promotion, another solution is you get old people to take, or you get rail rejectors to take a train journey, or ideally 3 or 4, and because they now use the train, they're forced to have a more positive attitude to train travel to maintain their own kind of cognitive consistency. So that's, you know, a lot of the time advertising proceeds on the basis that people are walking around with these attitudes which need to be changed. Actually, I mean, young people are partly hostile to cars, okay, because they haven't got cars. Let's be absolutely honest with it. Okay, you know, a lot of young people in London can get by without a car. They don't own a car. They have a bicycle. They really, really disapprove of cars. Okay, nobody growing up in the country disapproves of a car, because your first aspiration is to buy a car, and without a car, you don't have much of a social life, because the buses don't run after 6 o'clock. Okay, so, you know, an awful lot of these things where, and I think this is a bit of a growing trend, is we're confecting opinions to fit in with our circumstances to a large extent. One of the most interesting things is there is no correlation between ownership of an electric car and your attitude to the environment or climate change. Just now, what there may be is that people who buy electric cars will then start to think about getting solar panels, and having got an electric car and a solar panel, they'll now get more interested in environmental matters. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't necessarily have to change. There's a, okay, in Orthodox Judaism, okay, there's a ceremony of some kind, there may be someone who knows about this, where you bind things to you bind 2 things to people. I don't know if it's part of the bar mitzvah or something similar to that, and they tie the first one of these things, it's a kind of amulet, is tied to the arm, and the second one is tied to the forehead. And the order in which they do that is an acknowledgement of a point that sort of Aristotle made, I think, separately, that actually it's the behavior that comes first and the attitude follows. And the interesting thing is that because our brain tells us a story about how we made decisions, which is often along the lines of, I always wanted to do this, so I found a way to do it. Whereas actually a large part of our behavior is, I ended up doing this thing, so I found a reason to do it subsequently.
And therefore,
anybody who gets pissed, okay, this is an awful thing to say, but someone who gets pissed and has an affair with someone, okay, will probably on their way home build up a completely unwarranted case against their own wife. Okay. Okay, wife, girlfriend, husband, it doesn't really matter. Okay, But the ego defense mechanism will be such, which is that you're not happy saying, I just got pissed and did this stupid thing. Instead, you'll contrive reasons quite often which lay the blame at the foot of somebody else.
The behavioural science of affairs. Who knew?
Well, sorry to interrupt you there. If you want to watch the rest of this live stream, you're going to have to join the full edition of the Mad Masters course. Now, what is Mad Masters, you might ask? It's a course that blends behavioural science, creativity, and data, and it's all delivered to you by the one and only Rory Sutherland. Through monthly live sessions, on-demand Netflix-style modules, load of bonus sessions, and even an in-person meetup at the biggest marketing event in London, there's 30 plus hours of content delivered to you exclusively by Rory. So what are you waiting for? Pull the trigger and register now.